Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to see you here today. We're glad that you could come and join Yesterday in Turner and listening to the presentation by Dr. David Lewis. He's a member of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, and he's been involved in a lot of different things in research. And he's just written a book that has been available on the table here, The Tribal Histories of the Willamette Valleys, and he's going to talk about that tonight. We're really excited to hear that. There's an old map dating from 1851 that is over here against the whiteboard, if you want to have a chance to look at that at some point. We are excited to be able to turn the podium over to Dr. Lewis and to learn everything that he is willing to share with us about his research. And Dr. Lewis, you're down at, are you in the School of Anthropology or whatever, liberal arts, and down at Oregon State? And I think that we've just been blessed every time we have asked him to speak at any of the historical society groups. He has always done a wonderful job, and we look forward to what you're going to be able to tell us tonight. So without further ado, if there's anything else you'd like us to say or you'd like to tell us about yourself, feel free.
You said it all. Thank you. Well, thank you. Again, it's good to see many of you for second, third time, maybe fourth time. Some people 10th time. So I've been working in this area a long time. I've been, sometimes going to the radio station out in Mill City and doing work out there. But I just got a job a few years ago at OSU, so now I'm able to do things in a little more professional manner. And the book is part of that. Even though I actually started writing this 10 years ago, it's actually a part of the projects that I was doing in this area with other people. And so I think it's kind of cool to come back and talk to you guys again about the project again. So let me just get to the book here. So here's the book. If you've seen it, some of you have a copy now. That's great. If you're still on the fence about it, I'll sell a few more after the book, after the talk too. So I know not all of you are like, I don't know if I want to buy that book. It's way too expensive and it's too colorful, too pretty. I just hate it.
You'll sign on it.
No, I like the cover. I mean, I think it was a good choice for the cover. There's a native artist out of Vancouver by the name of Greg Robinson, who is from the Chinook Nation. He's an artist. He does carving, he does public art, he does paintings like this, and sometimes a little more dramatic stuff. And he's pretty good. He let me use basically anything in his catalog, and so I chose this. I think it looks very much like a valley scene, kind of rolling hills, and I thought it was kind of cool. So I like it mainly because one of the reasons besides that it's pretty and everything, is because if you go into a bookstore and go to the history section, everything's kind of dull and drab and black grays, and this is really super bright. So hopefully it's a lot of attention. So I began writing this book maybe 10 years ago in another form. Even had a different title for it, several different titles over the years. And it's all part of my project that I was working on, writing all these essays out into a blog form. So I have a website I call Indian History Research, or the Cortex Journal, which has right now over 500 essays on it. So it's quite a lot of research on there. And I just was working a lot of part-time jobs. I didn't have a lot of free time to do set aside to make a book. So I just did a lot of small projects, small research projects, and put some essays together. And then I think at one time, in 2016, I was doing 70 essays a year, which was quite a bit of work, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. And in the meantime, I was teaching down at PSU and other places. And so I did a lot of essays on this area, on the Kalapuyans and their interaction with settlers, on their treaty rights, removal to reservation. I was trying to work on as how close can we get down to the actual day of what was happening with them in the valley. And I got pretty close in many ways. And so over time, it's developed into a little more detailed image of the tribes and their removal to the reservation and what happened to them on the reservation. And so those essays on the blog turned into sort of like the first draft of chapters in the book. And so I jammed a bunch of essays together and sort of made something happen. And so the book is a little more better researched, a little better written, not a lot of sort of hopefully grammatical errors. Some people were very clear when they were telling me, you should edit your blog post better. And I'm like, well, it's just me. I don't have like a crew of people working on this. I'm just doing it, okay? So, but I do go back and fix things occasionally and add things to it, which is, the benefit of the blog is you can go back and it's your own product. You don't have to follow any rules. You can just do whatever you want. I mean, I do reference stuff, and then if I want to, I can go back and change the article too. And there's nobody saying I can't do that. So it was a really fast way to get information out really quickly to people that are educators, people who want to know Native history, to the tribe, to just anybody online, and that worked out pretty well. So I was getting a lot of people writing me saying they're using it in their classes, and everybody was always asking me, are you going to write a book? Are you going to write a book? And I'm like, okay. So I had to promise to write a book some years ago, and eventually it came true. So that's good. I made good on that one promise. I'll never make another promise again. So it's really about, you know, the Kalapuya, the Molalla, the Clackamas peoples of the Valley, the things they were going through, the challenges they faced in the midst of settlement and colonization of their lands, and then what happened to them when they got on the reservation. We'll talk a little more detail about that in a minute. And then really the colonization era, and then as they're sort of being moved onto the reservation, what happened in the next decades on the reservation. The things they were challenged with, things like assimilation and having, you know, where do they work? And are they citizens? And what happens when you're not a citizen? All that stuff is a huge challenge to Native people that were from this place for maybe 10,000 years. And so that's kind of that part. Why I wrote this? Well, you know, when I was coming up in Oregon, and I somewhat grew up in Salem, and went to, you know, McKay High School, Sweegle Elementary, so on this side of town, and I didn't hear any stories about my people, my tribe. I remember the Grand Ronde tribe, I'm a descendant of the Santiam. I didn't hear any stories about them in school, and that's, I think, the experience of a lot of people that are Native or say Black or Latino or whatever. They don't hear their experiences, their family experiences in schools or in society or anything else. And so I was always wondering why that was the case. I was hearing from my family at least that we're Native and stuff like that, and not a lot of detail about what that meant. And so I went on this sort of quest to sort of figure that out for myself over years, like 30 years, 40 years now. And I got to the point where I realized that it's not just one generation that's in that boat. It's like every generation in Oregon, because nobody was exposed to Native education unless you actually sought it out in college or something. So I thought, well, maybe because I'm becoming something of an expert in the subject, I should write a book up or write essays up and sort of educate people about that history, because people seem to be very interested in it. I mean, look, you guys are in the room. People were asking me to talk about it. When kids were coming to my classes when I started teaching, they were saying, well, I have to rethink everything I learned in high school. And what does that mean about our education system if the kids are coming out of it saying, we didn't learn anything about something that's very important. And so that's now become something of a project in the state of Oregon. We have a law that says, you know, SB 13, where they have curriculum written for schools, but right now our school districts are in such a case that they don't have the time and money to really implement that curriculum in school. You know, teachers are up against the wall in terms of time, and they don't have the time, literally, to do that. So how do we do it? And I don't think they've come up with a good answer yet, because right now, the majority of school districts are not using that curriculum at all, even though it was developed by the state of Oregon. So we're in that situation. So I thought, well, maybe my book will help alleviate that problem. There is an easily readable source, and it's actually written in a more common language. It's not really heavily academic. And it provides information perhaps in a more interesting way, than other history books. It's local, it's relevant to your context here or anybody else's histories, wherever they're from in the valley. And I tried to be as accurate as possible, because a lot of our old history books that don't sometimes mention many people at all will at times get the details wrong, get the dates wrong, get lots of little things wrong that they shouldn't be getting wrong, because part of the problem of academia is sometimes you don't want to go back and do research on the original information about those peoples. A lot of scholars tended to just accept what the previous generation of scholars wrote and just pass that forward to the next generation without really checking if that was the case at all. And so what I've done in my research is I've gone back to the original records, the federal records, ethnographic records, sometimes records of people talking about themselves, transcripts, and tried to, as much as possible, represent the native voice about what they were going through, and then using federal records to sort of back it all up. So I'm not, and I chose not to go and read all the history books and reference all of the well-known histories by scholars named Beckham and stuff, because a lot of times they have their own focus. They are interested in wars, they're interested in other things. I'm not so interested in that. I'm really more interested in what happened to Native people. What did they experience? So that's my reasons. So when I first gave them the early manuscript, they wanted to spice it up a little bit. They said, well, what about if you added some information here about what you experienced as you're learning about your history, or about your own experiences? How does this affect you? And so let me just read this piece. I didn't realize that our lifestyle was a result of our family being native. There was no inherited wealth in the family at all. We had held on desperately to a small 1¼ acre piece of property acquired the GI Bill because we had nothing else. The irony is that our property in Salem was within the original San Juan Kalapuya territory, one of the tribes I'm descendant from, yet we struggled to maintain a normal life only a few generations after our lands were taken away. Our people had lived in Oregon for more than 10,000 years and lived well off the land, yet in a short period of time in the 1850s, we lost all of our rights and future wealth for generations to come. At some level, we continue to relive that loss with each new generation. So that's one of those personal essays about my family. Growing up, I grew up in Salem, and I remember my dad sometimes having 2 or 3 jobs, trying to make a living. He eventually settled on becoming a copier repairman, had his own business. I remember even talking about him serving copy machines all throughout the area around Salem, so even out here. So later on, he became I guess he was an electrician for both casinos, the Grand Ron and Sluts casinos. And he helped install the games out there when they first got the casinos in the 1990s. And then was a manager out there for a long time. And so, but initially when he first got out of the Army, he struggled. He got a piece of land and he was going to school, but it was a tough life. We didn't have a lot of extra money, and I just came to realize that was not just us, but every person in the tribe had been in that same situation. And it's because for generations, in the 19th century into the 20th century, we were not allowed to keep a piece of land. And that's the basis of much wealth in the United States. So that's a huge problem today, even today. So, and the book doesn't just talk about me, it talks about other stuff like decline of tribes, sometimes there's a lot of erroneous information out there. And so, there was not a case of smallpox blankets in this area, if you've heard that. There was cases really far in the past, like 400 years ago maybe, on the East Coast where it may have happened, but not here. So the malarial epidemics caused the greatest change in tribal cultures. Tribal life was changed and many tribes collapsed. Previously powerful tribes disappeared. New confederations rose and the immigrants from neighboring tribes of the United States filled in empty spaces. Still, the remaining powerful tribes have maintained their claims to their traditional territories, and these are reflected in the treaties of the 1850s. Early American settlers recorded the decline through letters and journals, and anthropologists recorded the remaining vastly changed tribal cultures that were quickly disappearing, and further decline on the reservations due to settler-borne stresses. So there's lots of stresses on Native people back in the day. First, the big one was malaria. That took away 95% of the people. So what settlers saw was a bare fraction of the original numbers. And that left a lot of sort of free land unprotected. They could not protect their land from settlement. And we saw Native people and we saw settlers coming in and taking over the lands, and them basically having to accept that, and then beginning to modify their lifestyle to fit with that new culture coming at them. A lot of them hired on. I've heard stories today about how Native people hired on and helped build farms, helped build barns, build fences, and they would do that for trade. A lot of things that settlers brought were interesting, like guns and like metal and knives and beads, fabrics. These are all interesting things the tribes didn't have originally. And so they would work for a whole day for a beaded necklace or something. That was common. But things didn't happen. Weren't really amiable all the time. Lots of conflicts, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Settlers came in and they brought in a new philosophy of what we call land tenure, agriculture. Tribes in this area didn't have agriculture. So the settlement of the Oregon Territory changed the environment for Native peoples. As the valley floor was changed, native plants eliminated starvation among the Kalapuyans, who depended on the annual harvesting of these plants for the regular seasonal round was significant. When settlers arrived in the region, they were encroaching and claiming tribal lands as their own. They hunted out the game, plowed and fenced the prairies. These were primary resourceful lands where the tribes dug roots, gathered wild grains and berries, and hunted. The settlers' farming, ranching, and fencing the land caused changes that made the life hard for the tribes. Plowing fields destroyed natural food plants like camas and yampa, and livestock like hogs rooted out tubers and roots, while cattle caused erosion. So it wasn't so much a problem when maybe a few settlers came in the first few years, maybe even a few hundred. But as settlement increased on the Oregon Trail, we saw tens of thousands of people come in, and they each wanted about a mile square parcel of land, and that became part of American law in 1850. Each married couple could get a mile square parcel of land, or 640 acres, and that quickly began taking land away from the tribes. Once you plow the land up, you destroy native plants, and the tribes in the 1850s were basically starving. Their hunting was, the settlers are good hunters, they had guns and things, they were fishermen, and they were also taking away the plants. And so we start to see a rapid change of the culture of the tribes. They began to sort of have to live like settlers. We saw that happening in the Umpqua Basin a lot, where Native people were setting out their own land and creating their own fields. They had their own livestock, but they were not allowed to keep that because later on settlers came along and destroyed them. But the Kalapuyans here were also becoming good farmers. They were already, folks in the Tualatin area were already good farmers. They could already help out on farms really well. And the thing is, they were not citizens of the United States. They were considered to be vagrants. They were called vagrants and thieves because when they begged for food, when they were starving, a lot of settlers turned them away, not wanting to share their wealth. So they were starving, and they basically were stealing cattle, and eventually some people were shot for that. You know, there's stories of people being shot for stealing cattle. And, you know, cattle rustling was a big deal, you know. But settlers didn't even take into account the tribes had been there first. And in that time period, up into 1855, the tribes technically still owned all the land. There was not a sale of land by the tribes under any kind of treaty or agreement until March of 1855. So all of that conflict over land beforehand was in our terms today would be called squatting. You know, you would not accept people coming onto your land and taking it over from a foreign country, and that's what was happening. So the tribes, the solution was to put them on the reservations, do what they can to save whoever tribes were left. The original population counts for Kalapuyans are around 16,000 before settlement, and at the time when they would be moved to the reservation, there was like 640. And by 1900, the original population at Grand Mount altogether with the 32 tribes was about 1,200 people. By 1900, there was 400 people left. So you see there's a huge decline as these stressors hit them, not just off reservation, but even on reservation there was like declines there too. So it just went on and on. So a lot of times tribes are being induced to move to reservations. A lot of times they had signed the treaties just to get some resources and some money. They didn't actually want to remove. Because they didn't really trust the word of the Americans, because the Americans sometimes had broken their words in the past. And so they had to be induced, which was convinced to move by Indian agents to the reservation. Many Native people stated they did not get what they were promised. The many stories of broken promises of the federal government to the tribes are always related to what the tribes were promised to induce them to move to the reservation. The treaties included promises of food, housing, services, but in the final year, when Indian agents were trying to get the tribes to fiscally remove, the agents made additional verbal promises. Many of these promises were not documented in the treaties, but were stated during meetings with the tribes. These promises became part of the oral history record of the tribes and are passed through tribal descendants to the present. We have stories among the Malala, we have stories among the Coos people, many tribes about the promises made by Indian agents. But many of those Indian agents, when they made a promise, sometimes the next year they would be fired or they would resign or something. So all the promises they made went away. There's nothing written down, there's nothing in stone. So a lot of that sort of led to these thoughts about the Americans betraying them. You know, the Indian agents were not necessarily truly representing the word of the federal government. They didn't have the power to do so. They just had the power to negotiate. That was it. So, when we see records of like the Coos, for example, is a good one. That I don't really talk about much in the book, but they had a visit by Joel Palmer, the Indian Superintendent of Oregon, in 1855 when he came up the coast. He signed all these agreements with the tribes. The agreements became the Coast Reservation, or the Coast Treaty. That treaty was never ratified. And so the tribes, though, kept that as part of their oral history. And just about every generation, you hear like another excerpt of that. 1870s, they were repeating that record to Indian agents of Palmer 20 years earlier, making these promises. In the 1930s, when they were going through like lawsuits to get their land back, they repeated those exact stories of dealing with Palmer and Palmer promising to buy their land. In the 1970s, when tribes were going through restoration efforts, they were repeating those promises before committees that came to Salem to hear their testimony. So those things have a life of their own. Those promises kept the Coos people together and going, and today they're a tribe, Coos Laurent. So that was some of the powerful what the power of oral history can have in a tribe. It keeps people together around a certain purpose that the United States owes them for that land, and they've never paid it. We're going to get that land eventually, and they keep going. Generation after generation, 6, 7 generations later, they got some land and they got their tribe back. So that's an interesting story. So conditions on the reservation is a big issue I raise. Not a lot of histories go into conditions. A lot of times histories will kind of end in the first paragraph, sometimes first page, where tribes basically sign treaties and then go to the reservation and they basically disappear from history. But on the reservation, while tribes are somewhat separate from the white population outside, what they call the white settlements in the Willamette Valley, they're still integrating with them, they're still working for them, they're still working in farming, they're still harvesting crops, but they generally live on the reservation. And they were not living very well. The federal government, as we know, is not very good at managing money nor people, and didn't really understand in the first few years how big Oregon was, how far the distances were, or how bad the weather can get. And so I know some of you probably have experienced the muddy roads around Salem, muddy paths, muddy trails. That's where it was everywhere in Oregon, and especially if you go mountain roads. There were times where they said it was impossible to get to Siletz because the trail was so bad with mud they could not get the wagons through to take supplies there. The same thing sometimes with Grand Ronde. You couldn't go past Grand Ronde sometimes because the trails to the coast were so bad. So part of their food budget was also paid for. They had to pay for the transportation of the food, not just the food themselves. So those costs to like teamsters to transport all that food to the reservation was extreme. It was a long distance and it was tough. So the Grand Ronde Reservation for some 20 years, the tribes were not given land to farm, food, or adequate services like health care. Many people died the first few years, never seen the promises fulfilled. When natives first came to the reservation, they were all relieved of their weapons. They could not hunt. Many of them were unfamiliar with this northern territory, did not know where the wild foods grew like camas, berries, or where the good fishing rivers were. The tribes had to instantly change their diets from wild foods that they caught, hunted, gathered, or dug to beef, pork, flour, oil, and some vegetables. These are foods the native people had little experience with. The tribes were completely at the mercy of the federal agents and the environment, and the sudden cumulative changes of 1856 contributed to malnutrition and to sicknesses. So we see records of about half the camp being ill in 1856. We see people living in canvas tents most of the year, even through the winters. We see food getting lost on the way to Grand Ronde. Sometimes over the years you see these investigations of Indian agents, and a lot of times what happens is they will have sold supplies to a local community, supplies bought for the native community. There's lots of cases where they would get this really premium food that was shipped to them, and they would sell that, at a local store, probably McMinnville or something, and then they would buy worse food for the tribes. There's one case at Siletz where the agent actually stole all the school books, went down to the LA area and sold them all, and then had the nerve to write back to ask for his last paycheck. So, and he was caught. He was caught red-handed. They did an investigation, and that's what he said. So it's really interesting. These conditions on the reservation are really interesting. It was not definitely not a country club. It was definitely really poor conditions up into the 1870s. So because of that situation, a lot of people sought work off reservation. They didn't have any jobs on the reservation per se. The land, for one thing, was really bad at Grand Ronde. It was clay. It's still clay. So, and they're expected to grow at least half their food. That didn't happen. So what they had to do was leave the reservation. A lot of men went into logging, cannery works, things like that. A lot of women and other family members would go into harvesting crops in the fields. A lot of them came into the Salem area, to Wheatland Ferry area, independence and would harvest hops when hops became a big deal. Hops, beans, berries, things like that. I'm just repeating what says here, really, but so that's what the situation was. I mean, logging was a big deal for the tribe. We have now families that have been in logging for 4 or 5 generations. Some of them own their own companies at one point. So that's the few industries that got fair pay. All the other industries, if they were native, they got less wages than if they were not native. So that's just the situation. So there were a lot of people that chose to leave the reservation, and if they were less than full-blooded, they looked like somebody else, the other person in society, or they could pass, they would basically not declare themselves native, and you make twice the wage. So that is a situation that happened quite a bit. So we can't say that the decline in population of the reservation is all by disease or by just death. It's also because people just didn't want to live there. It was a bad place to live. And they wanted to look for opportunity somewhere else, like Portland or Oregon City or someplace else where they can actually have an opportunity for their family. Some of these transcriptions are pretty interesting. This is at a meeting with all the chiefs of the tribes in Oregon. They all came to the First Methodist Church in Salem, and they had a big meeting between themselves, church leaders, and Indian agents. The chiefs of the reservation pushed back against Bruno's words, citing they had been taught to drink by whites, and everyone seemed to be drinking and gambling anyway, so why stop? They wanted equal treatment. They explained how poor everything was on the reservation. They had no resources, and the promise of land sales and treaty making had not worked. They were still poor while the whites got rich. They revealed that the white Indian agents were not following the laws, the United States was not properly following their agreements on the treaties and giving allotments and funding for the needs of the reservation. That went on at least into the 1870s. There's another one, 1872, Chief Louis Nipissing and other chiefs of the reservation signed a petition sent to President Grant. I have now been on the reservation 16 years. During that time, I have seen poor white men come here as officers out of the stay a few years and go away rich, while I and all my people have always been growing poor. We at first had a great deal of money when we came here in agreement with the terms of the treaty, but my people have never got much benefit from that money. Superintendents and agents have got all of it. While I have seen my people die for the want of food, just as our horses die in the winter when they have nothing to eat. The men you have sent here for our officers have not only stolen our money, but they have violated our women, scattered diseases among us, which have reduced our numbers from thousands to hundreds. So this is not a person that was going to take it anymore. He was not a citizen of the United States, but he was going to say something. He was demonstrating himself as a chief by speaking out to President Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was the first president in a long time, in some almost 20 years, who made a statement during his inauguration that said that Native people deserved a chance for citizenship if they civilized, and so he was going to create a path. And so he got the Indian Service to begin to help them out more. We saw help come to the tribes in the 1870s. We see 1880s, the reports from the reservation that they were basically self-sufficient. They were running their own sawmill, their own grist mill, and they could operate like a 12-horse team when they were plowing fields. So they were doing really well, even though their own land was pretty crappy. They would hire their services out to farmers off the reservation for this work. And so, and that's because they didn't really, were learning not to count on the people from the agents of the United States. They learned to do it all by themselves. Yes?
I was just wondering, so what made Grant different that he did that? You know?
I don't know. That's a good question. You want to do some research? Go ahead.
Was it successful?
Well, not initially. We don't see citizenship happen until 1924. The problem is in the United States that Native peoples, Indian reservations, are all managed by thing called Indian policy, which is really a political process. So each new administration that comes in office at the reservation can change that. In each of the treaties, it says the president can sort of change the deal at any time. And that's what they did. Sometimes they changed the deal, almost always to the detriment of the tribes. So basically, writing this is basically fixing problems with history, rewriting history. Growing up in the Willamette Valley and later researching the Kalapuyan peoples, there were few hints from settler accounts that the Indians lived anywhere other than on the reservations. Many sources address the treaties or removal of the tribes to reservations, then their history ended. Alternative history shows that Native people, even if that homes on the reservation, had roles to play off reservations, laborers or symbols of the American Indian spirit as they adapted to American society. History shows that many Native individuals accepted in their own terms a changing culture, learned to live and adapted well, while also finding ways to continue their culture and heritage. Many of these people, however, were exploited in some fashion for their labor due to their lack of citizenship and therefore lack of protections and rights in society. So we have more. This is the second part of the presentation coming up. Oh, good. I have almost half an hour. All right, so I'm doing further work. It's kind of hinted at in the book where I start talking about more environmental type histories. Because for me, I'm getting pretty close to the end of like written records. And when you get to the end, what do you do then? So the environment itself is a record of the tribes. So the tribes, in anthropology, we have this sort of theory that Native people change the environment, or people just change the environment. But the environment also affects and changes Native people by the resources that are available, by the amount of water there, by the climate that's there, by whatever it offers. And so I'm starting to really get into a lot of environmental type histories, trying to figure out what the environment was like before it was radically changed by farmers and settlers. And this is kind of some of my explorations in that area. So first off, I'll start ethnographically. I mentioned this to some people earlier today, but there are these journals of the Wilkes expedition from 1841. Charles Wilkes came was surveying from like 1838 to 1842 or so throughout the Pacific, and he eventually came to the Northwest Coast. And there's a big wreck off the coast of where Astoria is called the Peacock Wreck. And then his expedition goes on land then, and they come to Fort Vancouver, and essentially the expedition is split in half. Half of the members went up to Columbia, half the members went down through the Willamette Valley, and eventually go to Sacramento. And most of these guys are either officers, like military, naval officers, or they're scientists. So they're all supposed to keep records. And so what's interesting is Charles Wilkes' books, which you can get, they're fairly free online, don't mention a lot of the records that I found in these journal accounts. So for whatever reason, he didn't go and get the journals of some of the scientists that went south. He doesn't actually proceed with the expedition going south. He goes down as far as Salem, visits a few people around the Salem area, and then goes back up north and joins the expedition going up to Columbia. Down south, we have these 3 or 4 journal accounts that we found so far, and I had to read them. No, they're not published, so I have to read them in the original pencil. That pencil has been rubbed for 180 years rubbed together, and so it's really, really hard to read. So this is what I've been able to gather, and I focus on a couple things. One is cultural burning, the other is water. And so August 11th, 1841, this account from George Emmons basically I'm not going to read the whole thing, basically talks about how all the land around them is burnt. They're walking down through the prairie from Salem, and there are these green patches on the edge of the prairies that are all woods where the fire has basically stopped. And so he's proceeding south in August at about the time when we know the Kalapuyans were out setting fires to the valley. And they did this on an annual basis. They set fires to the prairies. We know, the people have been talking about this for 30 years now. And so, and that's also mentioned by James Dana on September 9th. A dry grassy area, mostly burnt with scattered oaks. So for literally a month, they're walking south through the valley. The thing is, they have horses, but they're walking. And so it turns out that if you read every individual day account, that they would camp on the prairie in the middle of this burnt field, and the horses have nothing to eat then. They take off trying to find something to eat. The next morning they figure out the horses are gone. They have to send scouts after the horses. It takes them a half day to a day to find the horses. So in the meantime, the rest of the expedition is walking south, and the other ones have to catch up with this. So that's why it took so long to get through the valley. Otherwise, it wouldn't take you a month to walk through the Willamette Valley, right? Or us, maybe us, because we're not that much in shape, but you know. So, but that's interesting, you know, this idea, he's actually describing the character of the fire, what it did. It actually stops at these like thickets of trees, kind of by creeks and rivers, because it's a little moisture in that area. And there's other accounts in here of there being rains occasionally in the valley, which we all know happens in the Willamette Valley, right? It rains all the time. And then on September 10th, they get down to about the beginning of Long Tom River, which has a name, Lake Lamali, they call it. And it's because there'd been a rainstorm a couple nights before, and around here, if you don't have drain fields in your land, it turns into all this like low puddles, this shallow puddles all over the place. And I've been reading about that, about why that happens, and there's soil scientists that say, well, it's because we have a lot of clay in our land, the valley, and that clay creates a rain barrier, a water barrier, and it keeps the water up on top of the land unless you somehow destroy that clay barrier. And so that's what happened. They're describing this like expanding lake that's 80 feet in width and 3/4 miles in length, and from Emmons down below it says it's about a foot deep. And it's called a swale. It's the result of that sort of what they call freshet or summer storm, and the water is sticking around. So this kind of related to other work I was doing, but I was looking for more evidence of this, and we started to look at the GLO maps, General Land Office maps from the 1850s, and we see this big Camas swale. This is out by Rickyall. It's still there today. There's a big Camas swale out there with tons of Camas. It must have had tons of Camas in it. That's why they call it the Camas swale. A big swaley area, big watery, swampy area out there by Rickyall, kind of near where Basket Slough is today. So, and then if you look further, so I put together a couple maps on one map here, and we see Lake Labiche is a huge, long lake just north of Salem in 1852 or so. There's a big lake called Poison Lake out by Mount Angel. It's that greenish lake there. And then on the north, and there's a big lake that was called the Miry Swamp or Slough out by Woodburn. So this is becoming a very common landscape characteristic, this wetland areas in the valley. And then this other map here are two areas that I noticed in the Tualatin Valley. They have these giant swamps coming off the Coast Range. So the water was coming off the Coast Range, and it was creating this giant swampy area. So that's really interesting. South of Eugene, there's another place called Camas Swale. This Camas Swale is still there. If you drive on I-5 south of Eugene, past Crestwell, you'll see a sign on the highway that says Camas Swale. Remember that? That's what that is. So this was there, 1852. And then we have accounts from people in Eugene. They say, they call it Camas Swale. Yes, because there's lots of camas out there. You know what camas is? Those are the blue flowers, come up sort of tall, Indian scallop. That's by William Henry. And then we also have accounts of just the environment. Like the site of Eugene at that time was very wet. Several sloughs across the area. It was sort of a marshland. So that gives us a lot of clues as to, and I'm going north and south from the valley, right? As to what the original character of the valley was that the Kalapuyans lived within before it was radically changed by settlers. a big morass of sloughly, swampy, swaley areas at the right time of the year. I don't want to do that. My other research, I went to, I grew up on the east side of Salem, down Cordon Road from Lake LaBiche. I remember actually weeding out onions in the lake. I got a job when I was 17, and I hated that job, but I had it for a week, and I gave up because I got pneumonia, and I was very unhappy about that. So I wondered, I've always wondered why it was called Lake LaBiche and there's no water there. It's all just cropland, right? You can see the depression where the lake should be, but the lake's gone. So I did some research and I found these GLO maps. I put them together. There's 3 maps here. And there's this huge wetland structure that goes all the way from, the one up in the north is that Poison Lake thing on the other map. And then it goes, and then it floods, comes out of the Pudding River and comes down into Lake LaBiche, and it has this huge swampy, swaley area off the side. And it goes, there's many arms and legs of it. And one of those arms goes right behind Chemung Indian School. And I have these thoughts that maybe they put the Indian School there because the land was worthless. It was called Worthless. They could get it for a song, right? And many of the farmers declared the land worthless too because there's too much water out there. You put those fields too close to the places where it flooded, and the flood would flood over your crops and destroy all your crops. So they were very upset. In newspapers, there's lots of accounts from them that said, well, this it's too wet out here. It's constantly drowning our crops, and we're not making any money. So they want to do something about that. So they got together with Oregon State University and the experimental division there, and and through them they were able to figure out ways of sort of draining out this area by using ditching and by creating a new thing called drain tiling. And they put drain tiles now in, you can do it today, they put drain tiles under a lot of land, and those drain tiles constantly drain out excess moisture from the land into the ditches that take all the water out to the Willamette River. That ditch today, this process happened at Lake LaBiche between around 1900 and 1918. And these 2 brothers from California, these land speculators, came up and they bought 1,000 acres. And from what I understand, the acreage was $1 an acre because it was worthless. And so they spent $100,000 of their own money to dig a 6-mile trench all the way to the Willamette River, and using a thing called a ditch witch. Nowadays it's a small thing. I've seen it on the back of a truck, on a trailer. Back then it was this giant wooden thing. So, but they did this thing, and all the other farmers joined them. They dug their ditches into that drainage. That drainage ditch today is LaBiche Creek. It goes right through the center of Kaiser. So by 1918, they were able to drain off this whole thing. It was no longer constantly flooded all year round. In the summer months, it was there was no flooding. And I read recently that the flooding would continue into the 1960s because in the wintertime it flooded quite a bit, so they had to put a dam up there finally on the other end of it to slow down the water quite a bit. Eventually they got it under control, so now in the wintertime it only floods occasionally.
Did you find any swales like in the city of Salem? Because I can think of an area that sounds kind of like this.
I think so. I think there are. I haven't really researched that closely yet, but yeah, I think there are. And then those brothers, they sold their property at Lake LaBiche after 1918. They must have made millions because after they drained all the lake off, their property went from worthless to the most highly prized land in Oregon because it has nice black peat soils that is super nutritious for plants, right? And there's still a lot of water. And so one of them invested in a neighborhood in Salem. Anybody guess what it's called? Their name was Hayes. So
Hayesville.
Hayesville. There you go. That whole subdivision was bought by that guy, one of the Hayes brothers, and he made millions off that. The other one went up to Wapato Lake. He bought more property at Wapato Lake by Gaston. Did the same thing there. They dug a ditch to the north, working with farmers, and eventually drained off this lake by 1935. It was a much bigger project, much bigger lake. That lake, we have a lot more information about from the tribes. There was quite a bit of Wapato there, hence the name Wapato Lake. Wapato is this nice nutritious plant that native people used as one of their best foods. Settlers even liked it. They substituted Wapato for potatoes in the first few years before they actually had potatoes, and they called it Indian potato. So, and then the tribes in 1851, when Indians came around and started writing treaties with them first, they wanted it as their reservation. So you see that square around the lake, that's their original planned reservation. They never got it. So, and then I was reading accounts, and something jumped out at me is that these canvasback ducks, and the ducks were eating the Wapato, so they were flying over in their seasonal flyover, and they would stop at the lake, eat the Wapato, and there were so many ducks, like tens of thousands of them, that sportsmen from like weekend warriors from Portland would come down there, set up duck blinds around the lake, and shoot them in the lake all weekend and leave the carcasses behind. Because if you're a businessman in Portland, you don't want to bring this nasty, dirty, bloody duck back to your house, right? So that's what they did. And the farmers were complaining about that because they left a big mess behind. So, so this happened here. So experimental station and farmers then had some nice test cases, and they began implementing this pretty broadly in the valley after at least 1918. Drain tiling became common, ditching became common, and I think that's why much of the wetlands in the valley are gone, because water now flows more directly out to the Willamette, which goes to Columbia, which goes to the ocean faster than it should be going. It should be sticking around longer for native species, for environment, for everything else. So we are greatly degrading our environment for anything else but us by letting the water go away so fast. So I found records of them doing the same thing down in the lower Klamath Basin. There's this record here of them, a bunch of farmers getting together and planning to invest in a project to drain off all the lower Klamath peat soils down there too. So this is not just Willamette Valley. It goes into every valley, probably then expanded to like Washington State, and California, and everywhere else, as people began to realize they could actually control the water. Because once you start controlling that water in a better way, those of you farmers around here probably know that, the actual growing season extends. You don't have to worry so much about the summer rains. Then you can grow like the European crops here that you couldn't grow before because the season's too short in the valley otherwise. So today, Labish is this onion fields mainly. There's some orchards. I think they have nut orchards now, and they have a lot of berries coming in. But most of it's onions. Nice black soils. This is it when they're harvesting them. One farmer, kind of a rebel, contacted me after I wrote my first essay about this. And he said he put 70 acres of his land into conservation some years ago. He got paid a lot of money for this, enough so that he was comfortable. And after 20 years, the Wapato started coming back. And he didn't plant it. So there's something of a seed bank in his property, and it allowed the Wapato to come back. So we've been going back every year now and checking it out, watching its expansion. This is it in decline, trying to figure out like what it does again, because we're relearning about Wapato. Taking pictures of leaves because I like leaves. Then digging some Wapato to see how it's doing. It's not the largest Wapato you've seen in pictures, but it's getting there. You can eat that. So roast it up and eat it. Yeah.
Does that plant flower?
Yeah, they have little white flowers. I should put some flowers on here. I don't have any. I'll get flowers this year. It has a little white flower. They're kind of nice.
No fruiting bodies later.
Huh?
No fruiting bodies later above ground.
No, they're about half a foot to a foot down. But you can see the soils, nice black soils. And then after a couple of shovelfuls, you can get several Wapato. You can live on that.
Is that something you can buy in a store, or?
You actually can, not in a regular grocery store like Safeway, but I've been to like a Chinese market,
Oh,
and they have them there. They're not labeled Wapato, but if you know what they look like, go there and compare the shrimp rack packages, you can see Wapato. And that was a thing, like when Chinese were brought here to sort of build things, they started to harvest Wapato. And they had a trade with native people with Wapato. So that was a thing, yeah. So here's your Wapato again. And this is it, this winter, got a taste of what it may have looked like as a lake again. So we're wondering like if parts of the lake could be returned. I'm gonna let some of the lake come back. It's kind of a conservation, restoration type way. You know, actually there are reports from the United Nations that suggest that in order to save our species on the planet, the diversity of species, we need to have 1/3 of our land reserved for native species. In the Willamette Valley today, we have 1%. So there's been no help for the environment here. And we have, and you see the mountain in the background? Mount Hood. Oregon presentation, you have to have Mount Hood. Another project outside of Salem, on the other side at Minto Brown Park, we see this field of partially juncus. Juncus is a native plant that Kalapuyans would use to sort of weave with. They weave baskets with it and stuff, like soft side baskets. Nice little, like kind of low spot in the prairie, where there's probably a lot of water there, and you see camas in the foreground. And then here's the trail there. If you've done that trail, you know it's kind of nice from the other angle. And then a couple years ago, it started to rain, and this is what happened. This is what should be happening. They should have a swale up here. The water sticks around for a couple days. Eventually, it does drain off to the local rivers and creeks, but that's what it should be like, right there. So it's kind of reminded me of some research I was doing at the time. And then a couple days later, it's gone. Native plants are fine. They're used to it. So I think there is some adaptation of the plants of the valley to partial wetland, partial dry. So they're not all prairie, dry prairie plants. They're partial wetland plants. Here's your camas, nice tall in the middle of the summer, or basically July. And then kind of into July, we see this, or into June, I'm sorry, see this, and then the one in the center is about 5 feet tall, so some can get pretty big. This is your giant camas.
How tall? 5 feet?
About 5 feet, yeah.
I have that, not giant, currently in bloom, actually.
Yeah,
right
there's
now.
some big ones out there.
It's
Yeah.
currently blooming.
Here's what camas seeds like, nice black seeds. And then, so we've had a lot of discussions in the valley of bringing back fire to sort of restore landscapes, cultural fires, maybe help with getting rid of the fuel loads in the forest, things like that. Well, I think in the valley here, because of the history of moisture, the amount of moisture we had and what it did to the valley, we have to bring back water too. There's some sort of a formula there between fire and water, which would keep our native landscapes really healthy. Yeah.
It's kind of a far-reaching question. I started thinking when you mentioned the malarial problem. And we're looking at swamps, which bring mosquitoes. Was there any, are you aware of the practices of the native people in terms of leaving places that were undesirable because they're swampy, because there's mosquitoes?
That's a great question.
Was there a seasonal migration up to higher ground, back down? I believe I learned that was the case in the Central Valley of California.
I think it was. I mean, I think they moved around enough that they didn't have to worry so much about that. About
Were there villages?
too much infestation.
Permanent?
When did the mosquito arrive in the valley?
Well, there were mosquitoes here previously, so it's not the mosquito that carried the malaria here. It's the people that were infected with malaria that brought that here, like the fur traders.
So that was imported, the parasite.
Right, and so we have a similar type of mosquito here that is an Anopheles type mosquito, And the Anopheles type mosquito can be the vector for malaria from somewhere else.
But didn't you say that their losses happened before the European settlement?
Right, so we that was in the fur trade era, so we had a lot of exploration. We had fur traders here at Fort Vancouver from, the fur trade started in 1811. Fur trade started in Oregon, and then Hudson Bay didn't really arrive until 1824. So and they said, so that's well before settlement, and so they were going pretty well, and then we started to see missionaries arrive, like Catholics and Methodists arriving in the 1830s, and then settlement didn't actually start in a big way until 1844.
I might be mistaken, but I do believe that they were essentially native, the mosquito, the parasite, to the east coast of this continent.
There's lots of varieties of mosquitoes.
What I heard
I'm
is-
not an expert on them.
Yeah, the
I
native
just know
people,
we have the Anopheles type here
Yeah.
that can carry malaria.
native people were smart enough not to put their villages down there next to the swamps.
And then it's
And-
the malaria that was, like you said, it was carried in the infected people.
Right.
And then it infected the mosquito population. The mosquitoes were probably always here, it's just that they had been
That's right.
exposed to the malaria that passed it to humans.
So the state of Oregon, I encountered documents online that said the state of Oregon was treating the waters, the standing waters in the valley, up into the 1950s for the Anopheles mosquitoes. So they basically eradicated it in Oregon. That's why they still treat the water, but it's not really a big thing in the valley anymore. In fact, we don't get malaria cases here anymore, so they eradicated malaria here. But I see what you're saying in terms of like moving around. There are some accounts like from the Applegates. When the Applegate settlers came through, there is a record of them stopping in the longhouses of the Kalapuyans and being eaten alive by lice, things like that, not necessarily mosquitoes, but lice. And so there are some people that refuse to stay in the longhouses of the tribes because there's so much lice. But I think that may have not been the Kalapuyans, that may have actually been the Chinookans that had a little more permanent existence with their longhouses. Kalapuyans actually moved around quite a bit. Like 3/4 of the year, they're actually moving around to temporary encampments.
Yeah.
So they're not necessarily staying in their longhouse all year round. So that may have been part of the purpose of what you're talking about, is them essentially airing out that longhouse for much of the summer, so they don't have pests when they get there in the fall. Good idea. And they also do have this tradition of not living down on the floodplains. So there's records from Eugene of them telling like Skinner, to Eugene Skinner, to not set his cabin down on the floodplains, to put it up on the butte, because it would flood down there. And we see, and I would assume that they would take their own advice. You know, you just, yeah.
I have a theory that that the reason that so many of the earliest settlers in this part of the valley settled up towards the Waldo Hills was for that very reason.
That's exactly what I found for Pleasant Hill.
Yeah.
In fact, there are accounts from people, settlers, or the sons and daughters of settlers in Eugene, that said that Elijah Bristow settled up in Pleasant Hill off the valley floor because he wanted to get away from the wetlands. So that may have been the case here around here too. People didn't want to live down in the main valley prairie floor. They wanted to move up a little more upland area where there was less water.
And I've also been, over recent months, trying to figure out, you know, looking at old maps and so forth, trying to figure out where the location of the Klamath Trail, you know, the main north-south. And surprisingly, it didn't go down I-5.
No, it goes down,
Well, I know
Kaplinger.
from very early records
Kaplinger.
that one of the block houses, that there was a block house that was built up just off of the Union Hill Cemetery Road.
I hadn't heard that. I mean, you
Yeah,
can see that.
I can send that stuff to you.
So we have a Klamath Trail that comes down into Salem, And I think it's Kaplinger is the last remnant of that, Kaplinger Road, and then
Yeah.
State Street. So,
There was also
line
something
up.
that was up in the Waldo Hills.
yeah, so
You know, like
right,
after
so,
Abaquah, that they came down.
right, so that
to-
trail comes out of the mountains, it comes over the Waldo Hills,
Right,
down to Kaplinger and down State Street, and it goes right to the waterfront, and at the waterfront was the Chemeketa Village.
What is the Klamath Trail?
Where Klamath people were known to come out of the mountains and come and do some trading and hunting in the valley.
So
There's quite a big history of that now.
Klamath people were this far north?
Yeah, so they would
Go
come
up to the
all the way from
Columbia.
Klamath area, and then once they had horses, they probably could go further, but they would come on these mountain trails, and there's a couple different routes. One of them goes into the Umpqua Basin, one of them goes into the Eugene area, goes right down past Oak Ridge into Eugene area, and another one comes down, like we said, comes down over the Waldo Hills, Kaplinger, State Street to Chemeketa Village. And they also would go further, end up in Oregon City, or even go further, end up in the Dalles.
and then the part that goes north-south, when they're heading from the western part of the Waldo Hills, approximately, well, it's a little bit east of Cascade Highway, and then it goes down and it crossed the Sandy M at David Mulkey's donation land claim.
Sure.
And surprise, surprise, the tribe owns that property now.
Yeah.
On an interesting note, that trail from Waldo Hills coming down State Street, camas grows out there east of town, so I'm sure that was part of their.
Yeah, I've seen quite a bit of camas out
To
there.
harvest camas as they come right on by there.
Yeah, it'd be nice to sort of lay out the trails better. I've never seen a good map of them yet, but I have pretty good records about where that trail was, and what the Klamath are doing here. They are really actually very good friends with the Molalla people, and they would camp near them and be intermarried with them too. And then they would come here every year. And they like hunting elk, so we apparently have a lot of elk here, so they would do that. Yeah, they were the tribe that caused the biggest problems in the valley. We hear about like any kind of Indian conflicts. If you read my blog, you can see those things, like Battle Creek and things like that. Abaquah, all those conflicts were caused by the Klamath, by them not really caring if they threatened the settlers or not. So.
When I was a kid, I went to elementary school right across the road from Battle Creek, and kids used to go across and find arrowheads.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty much at the end, so I mean, there's not much more. So yeah, we can do more questions if you want.
Take a bow.
On the subject of trails, were there common trails going from the valley over to the coast?
Yeah, they have those two. Yeah, we had one go right through Grand
An
Ronde.
annual thing where you went over to,
Yeah, there's one at Grand Ronde. They called it initially the Elk Trail. That becomes Salmon Highway.
that's an interesting concept, that Indian trails become pioneer wagon.
Yeah, so there's a process, and I
Become
documented the
highways,
process.
become-
I documented that for the Salmon Highway. If you read further enough into that, I usually Google books to look up stuff, but it initially was called the Elk Trail, and then they landed a bunch of, I think, stoves and stuff on the coast, and they had to get a wagon over there to like the Sluts area to get that stuff, and so they had to expand the trail to fit a wagon. And then after that, the native people, when they got to the reservation, they expanded it further because that became a constant route to the coast, and there was no other purpose other than for essentially a vacation for white people from the valley. It became a vacation site and like a honeymoon site for people in the valley, literally. And what I figured out, there's never been another industry at like Lincoln City other than tourism. That's always been their industry, always, from the very beginning.
They used to the moms and the kids would get on a train and head to the coast, and then they'd have daddy trains on Fridays after work, and the husbands would head over there.
Yeah, there was some stuff at Devil's Lake where they would do fishing and they do boat racing, and they would throw like big Fourth of July celebrations. People would be invited over there. They'd camp out and watch the celebration on the lake and stuff. But that's all tourism, and all those places like Rose Lodge, all those little hamlets have their own like hotel that had a dance hall on it and a bar, and they're all set out for people to come and vacation there. Yeah. That's always been the way. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention for your comment about Ulysses Grant. He was stationed at Fort Vancouver in 1852. He was there a year or so before he ultimately resigned from the Army. But while he was there, I happened to catch that he sent a note to his wife. He said, many of the real, my opinion is that the whole race, meaning the natives, would be harmless and peaceable if they were not put upon by the whites. He wrote that to his wife Julia in 1853.
That's pretty interesting thing you wrote, because that was pretty much the perspective of even the Army generals and officers that came here. Because it wasn't like you hear about these Indian wars and stuff. They were not really perpetrated in the first round by the Army. It was really the Oregon militia. They were untrained, basically Oregon farmers that joined the militia for extra income, and they were given free rein by the governor at that time, Curry, to basically destroy tribes. Yeah.
I just wanted to add a comment to the Grant president. So Lincoln, Civil War ends, Lincoln assassinated, then you got Andrew Johnson, bunch of drama there with impeachment and stuff. Grant was the next president, and he was focusing on citizenship for African Americans as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think he also just included natives in that, so I think it has to do with that timeline.
Yeah, he had more direct experience with natives, like fighting Native people. A lot of the men who sort of were fighting in the Civil War, they had their early experiences fighting Native people. In some capacity. So, yeah.
I'm really sorry.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't there. Yeah, so.
I know. Neither was I. Whatever.
Yeah.
How do we look at Joel Palmer's legacy then overall from a tribal viewpoint?
I don't know what the tribe thinks of it necessarily. I think that he did what he could, what he had. I mean, he seemed to really kind of respect the rule of law. He saw Native people as actually people rather than just an irritant. And he actually tried to do the best he could at the time he was here. And he actually set the blueprint for all of the reservations in Oregon, or nearly all the reservations in Oregon. So I think he did a pretty good thing. Now, you could look at some of his value systems and stuff. He definitely thought that Native people had to go to reservations. There was no, he didn't see any way that Native people could stay in their original lands. But he did want to, like, if there was a crime against Native people, against tribes, he did want, the people who perpetrated those crimes, that the white people did pay. And he was very upset that he could not get any kind of case seen or heard by a circuit court for crimes against Native people. Yeah. There's actually a book coming out by a descendant, Bill Lang, about Palmer, a new book, and he's going into quite a bit of detail about Palmer and his life. He's actually a lot of questions, so you'll see some of my comments there probably.
David, there is a book about Palmer. It's called An Arrow in the Earth.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
I've seen it, yeah. Yeah, I'm just saying that Lang is going a lot deeper than that one.
Do you want to tell them about your mountain?
My mountain?
Your mountain?
I don't have a mountain.
Well, the one you needed.
A couple years ago, I helped rename Mount Swastika to Mount Halo. Basically because the people wanted to get rid of the swastika name, and I had done some research on the local native chief, and it was Chief Halo of the Kalapuyans. So I proposed that, they accepted it, got through.
I think it's awesome.
So it's pretty cool.
Where's that at?
It's down there in, I think it's still Lane County. Is it Lane County? I think it's Lane County. Outside of Cottage Grove, towards the east. Yeah. It's not a really particularly awesome mountain. It's not like Hood or anything, so nobody really goes there. It's not really known for anything. I think apparently it was named after a rancher that named Swastika that lived out there.
Really?
They had a post office for like
Yeah,
a year or two. But it doesn't mean Nazi at that point. But nowadays the name has been so destroyed by history that people won't hear of it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much.